Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is Left Side of the Aisle. I'm your host, Larry Erickson. And for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I think are worthy of your attention. So I hope you'll stick with us. If you have any reactions to the show, any comments or responses, you can feel free to email them to me directly. This is my personal email, whoviating, whoviating at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus, Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be around here somewhere several times during the show. You get the email address from there if you missed it, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, however, just do me two favors. One, include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, this is about the show. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm just not very good at dealing with email. So, with that out of the way, we always like to start with some good news where we can. I got a little bit of good news today. It's on a topic we haven't touched much on recently, and this actually doesn't affect the United States, at least not directly, but it is evidence in a continuing change in attitudes in what I think is a positive direction, and I think it's good enough, or at least happy enough news to mention here. On August 10th, the Chief Justice of Belize, which is a nation in Central America, his name is Kenneth Benjamin, he ruled that a section of the Belize Criminal Code which, quote, barred carnal intercourse against the order of nature, actually contravenes the guarantees in the Belize Constitution that every citizen has the right to dignity, privacy, and equal protection of the law. Now, technically, the law does not single out gay men, technically, but that's how it's been understood, and that's how it's been applied. Under Belize's system, Justice Benjamin does not have the power to repeal the law, unlike, say, the Supreme Court here, but he can, and he did, make it essentially unenforceable. And, yeah, I think that's good news. Next up, we have one of our regular features. This is the Clown Award. And the Clown Award this week was, let's just call it, interesting. I had a couple of candidates, but one of them stood out so clearly that days before I did the show, I was convinced I had my clown until at almost the last minute he was outclassed by a pro. So our wannabe clown here is one Ken Taylor. He's the mayor of a rural town in the southeast corner of Arizona. He received an invitation to an August 24th meeting to take place in Laredo, Texas, of the U.S.-Mexico Border Mayors Association. This organization aims to have mayors on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, quote, speak in one voice in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City, this is how one of them put it, on issues affecting those mayors. Taylor answered this invitation in no uncertain terms that he would not, in all caps, he would not be attending because he apparently was deeply, deeply offended by the fact that the invitation was written in both English and, quoting him, Spanish/Mexican. One nation means one language, he declared, and I am insulted by the division caused by language. Of course, there are two nations involved here, but it seems he couldn't be bothered reading far enough to even realize that, being much too busy being outraged by the fact that anyone would or would want to be able to speak a language other than English. His defense against this, by the way, to what I'm sure is not your surprise, he blamed the media for taking it out of context. Okay, so what was the context? Taylor said, in fact, that his greatest objection was that by trying to arrange cooperation among mayors on both sides of the border, the organization, quote, is giving away U.S. sovereignty and making America subservient to Mexico. Yeah, that's much different, obviously. By the way, Taylor, he's mayor of Huachuca City, Huachuca being an Apache word meaning Thunder Mountain, and Huachuca City is in Cochise County. Just which is the one language that Taylor thinks we should all be speaking? Okay, given all that, how could Ken Taylor not be this week's clown? Because this came in the same week as the real gem. So the big red nose this week goes to perpetual loudmouth Rudy Giuliani. On August 15th, introducing the rump at a campaign rally in Youngstown, Ohio, Giuliani declared that, I'm quoting him here, under those 8 years before Obama came along, we didn't have any successful radical Islamic terrorist attack in the United States. They all started when Clinton and Obama got into office. Now first, let's recall that Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York City on September 11, 2001. Let's recall that he tried to run for president in 2008 with a campaign that consisted mostly of statements that, as Joe Biden famously put it, contained a noun, a verb, and 9/11. So whose fault, by the way, was this latest bit of numbskullery? You know, it was the media. In this case, for failing to realize that he was using abbreviated language and that he actually meant the 8 years since 9/11, even though that's not what he said. And in fact, several outlets jumped to his defense, saying, well, yeah, he did talk about 9/11 earlier in the speech before he said this. So, okay, the years since 9/11 were the 8 years before Obama came along. Except, of course, Barack Obama became president in January of 2009, which is closer to 7 years from September 2001 to 8 years. So maybe it's not its memory that's failing Rudy, it's his skills at basic arithmetic. But frankly, I think a likelier explanation is not that he forgot 9/11 happened. He forgot when it happened. Because like all good right-wing jackasses, it's part of his religion that George Bush could not have been responsible for 9/11. It had to be somebody else's failing. Okay, grant all of that, he's still a doofus. After 9/11, but before Obama became president, there were at least 4 attacks on U.S. soil that were declared by the FBI to be jihadist terrorist attacks, or were carried out by people who said that that was what they believed and that was their ideology. And there are others from the same period that may have been driven by that same ideology. And on top of all that, there is the fact that Rudy the G deliberately limited his oh-so-deep concern about terrorism to radical Islamic terrorism, because, as we all know, no other sort of terrorism counts, no other sort of worthy of attention, no other sort of victims are important enough to recognize, at least in the eyes of Rudy Giuliani. So no matter how you look at it, Rudy Giuliani, who earlier this month called the rump statement that Barack Obama is the founder of ISIS to be legitimate political commentary, Rudy Giuliani has proved that he is exactly what he has shown himself to be in all of these years since 9/11, a total clown. All right, next up. Something I want to get said. On Saturday, August 13th, a black man named Slivel Smith was shot and killed by a cop in Milwaukee. The anger that erupted in response led to 2 days of violence in the streets of the city, with businesses and cars trashed, rocks and bricks thrown, gunshots fired, and what has become known as the Milwaukee Uprising. Now, I'm not going to pass judgment on the cop here. According to various sources, his body cam, now it hasn't been released since I at the time that I'm doing this, but according to various sources, his body cam clearly shows that Smith was carrying a gun in his hand and that he aimed it at the cop. In those circumstances, you really can't blame the cop for firing, and I don't. What I am concerned about, however, is the reaction to the reaction to the anger in the streets. I fear that, as happens all too often in this country, we will learn all the wrong lessons from this, draw all the wrong, comforting, but deeply wrong conclusions. This explosion of anger and frustration, which is what riots almost invariably are, this explosion of anger and frustration was decades in the making. It reflects deep-seated, long-standing ills and pain in Milwaukee. But I fear that we won't say that. We won't say that this is. We won't see it as a call to justice, a call to repair the social fabric, a call to alleviate suffering, a call to challenge bigotry. I fear that instead of blaming racism and injustice and poverty and desperation, we will blame, as some already have, the underclass and its behaviors. We will blame tribal behavior. We will blame outside agitators. One official actually specifically blamed a group of members of the Revolutionary Communist Party who came from Chicago. Apparently all their fault. We'll hear about cop haters and people who just want an excuse to riot and loot. We will told over and over again, over and over in statements full of tut-tuts and tongue clicks, how violence solves nothing, as if hunger, unemployment, and police brutality were not themselves violent. And we will be told by implication how passive acquiescence, how that is, don't bother me with your problems, solves everything because it enables us to ignore those same problems. I fear that, at the bottom line here, I fear that even as the roots of this anger are getting some attention, there is some media attention to how bad the problems are, how bad the unemployment, how bad the poverty, how bad the pain is in major parts of Milwaukee. I'm afraid that this will prove to be just another blip on our social radar, and we will at the end of the day chalk it up to how those people don't know how to behave. And so we will relearn all the wrong lessons. All right, for the rest of the show, we're going to be talking about something else. Last week, I gave you a pretty bleak view about global warming, about its current and future effects, and how those effects will get worse in the not-distant future. I also promised you that this week I would offer you some reasons for hope. So let's get about doing that and lift the gloom at least part way. Thing is that good news about global warming is kind of hard to find, because you try to find good news about global warming and most of it proves to be right-wingers going that, oh, good news, global warming doesn't exist, or good news, global warming isn't as bad as it's supposed to be, or even, as some of them do, good news, global warming is good for you. But there is some actual good news. However, I'm going to start with the fact that there are some relatively recent technological advances that offer some promise in slowing the advance of climate change, and that can be extremely important for reasons that I will get to a bit later. However, I am going to start by running down a list of some ideas for addressing climate change that actually are very bad ideas, but the fact that they're being discussed indicates how serious these scientists and engineers who are proposing them realize the situation is. One idea is to shoot sulfur in the air in order to reflect incoming solar radiation. In other words, you want to fake a volcanic eruption. Another one is to construct a sunshade, like the ones you have in your cars. Construct a sunshade, creating an artificial ring of small particles or a spacecraft that would block some of the sun's rays from hitting the Earth. There's an idea to make airplanes take longer routes in flight by flying at lower altitudes, which would reduce the formation of heat-trapping contrails, but would also mean the planes are using more fossil fuel. There's an idea to make clouds brighter and more reflective with injections of seawater, which would reflect back more of the sun's heat into space, but also for the same reason would reduce evaporation from the surface, which means when those same clouds move to another area, they will not provide the rain that they otherwise would have, basically either creating or worsening drought. Another idea is to scrub the air, just scrub it of carbon dioxide, which makes sense, actually, if you're talking about, say, the smokestack of a coal plant. But if you're talking about the atmosphere in general, recall that carbon dioxide makes up 0.5% of the atmosphere. And so removing enough carbon dioxide to actually make an impact on global warming would actually cost a good chunk of the entire gross national product of the United States. Another idea is to dump iron into the ocean to stimulate the growth of algae in the hopes that the blooms will then act as a major carbon sink, which unfortunately won't work because as they sink, other creatures eat them, they excrete them, which means ultimately the carbon just gets recirculated back to the surface again. That last idea about dumping iron into the oceans relates to one that's been raised by James Lovelock, who you may know of. He's the creator of the Gaia hypothesis. This is where one that it views the entire world ecological systems as if it was one giant organism. He suggests artificially ramping up ocean mixing, which he says would stimulate the growth of carbon-munching algae, therefore sinking more carbon dioxide into the ocean. Unhappily, this runs to the same problem as dumping iron filings does. Not only does the carbon tends to get recycled back into the surface and then to the atmosphere, but of course adding carbon to the ocean increases ocean acidification. And all of these ideas share one fundamental flaw. None of them involve reducing our use of fossil fuels. None of them involve reducing our actual output of carbon. So, how about some more serious ideas? All right, we can get to those after the break. And here we are back again. All right, I was saying let's get to some more practical ideas, okay? One such idea is what's known as carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS for short. It involves a physical and chemical process to capture carbon dioxide from emissions, like at a coal plant or some other factory or whatnot, to separate the carbon dioxide from the other emissions, turn it into a liquid form, and inject it into cavities in the earth, often depleted oil wells or formations of sandstone harboring briny groundwater. The process is difficult and expensive, and there are always fears that the liquid carbon dioxide that you inject into the earth winds up escaping back into the atmosphere. Well, now researchers working in Iceland say they have discovered a new way to trap carbon dioxide deep underground by changing it into a rock. Results published this week in the journal Science show that injecting carbon dioxide into volcanic rocks triggers a reaction that rapidly forms new carbonate minerals, potentially trapping the carbon dioxide essentially forever. The thing is, instead of injecting the CO2 into sandstone, they inject it into basalt. And they thought the reactions involved in changing CO2 into carbonate minerals such as calcite. They thought it would take a long time, and were shocked to discover that, by their estimates, 95% of the carbon dioxide had been mineralized in just a year and a half. Now, there were real problems with making this economically feasible on a large scale large enough to actually affect climate change. First is that the source of the CO2 in this case in Iceland is a geothermal plant, and geothermal plants, let's put it this way: coal plants, they emit 20 times as much carbon dioxide as a geothermal plant does. Plus the fact that coal plant emissions are dirtier, no one actually knows if they would as rapidly mineralize as these would, and the fact that because coal plants emit so much more carbon, you need a lot more room to store them. But perhaps the biggest problem here, there aren't many places in the world with basalt formations easily available at the surface. Most of the basalt rock is at the bottom of the ocean. Iceland happens to be one of the exceptions. Still, none of that takes away from the fact that scientists say the project, which is dubbed CarbFix, actually offers a ray of hope. It offers a possible technological response. Meanwhile, however, still on the topic of carbon capture and sequestration, a new study is showing that material made from biomass could be 65% more effective in carbon capture, that is, in pulling carbon out of the emissions from plants and so on, 65% more effective than the way we do it now. The material has been around for 10 years. It's called starbons, and it's made from waste biomass, including stuff like food peelings and seaweed. It has what's called a mesoporous structure, which means it contains pores between 20 and 50 nanometers across. And to give you an idea of what that is, the typical pore on your skin is about 50,000 nanometers across. That's small. This extremely fine, but still porous structure makes it excellent for the purpose of capturing carbon dioxide, which is, again, the first step in capture and sequestration. The other advantage is while this process is still expensive, it's cheaper than the current methods of CCS. On the other hand, remember, this is still CCS. It's still carbon capture and sequestration. So it's another stopgap. It's not about reducing our carbon output. But again, such stopgaps could mean something significant. And again, I'll get to that in a minute. Because what's important to bear in mind right now, is that even without such technological advances, those kind of technological advances I just discussed, we have the tools to address global warming. We have the technology now. The website Skeptical Science, which is geared around refuting the arguments used by the nanny naysayers on global warming, Skeptical Science calls the idea that we do not today have the technology to deal with global warming a myth. And that can be seen in developments around the world, and here are just a couple of examples. In May, Portugal did something amazing, but actually truly significant. A combination of solar panels, wind turbines, biofuels, geothermal, and hydroelectric power came together, and for 4 consecutive days in May, the entire country's electricity needs were supplied using nothing but renewable energy. 3 U.S. cities, Aspen, Colorado, Burlington, Vermont, Greensboro, Kansas, are now powered by 100% renewable energy. 96 cities around the world have pledged to achieve the same. The entire nation of Denmark is aiming to have half its energy from wind by 2020 and all of its energy from renewables by 2050. By 2018, just like 2 years from now, Dutch trains will run on electricity generated by wind power. More than 200 of the 523 coal-fired plants in the United States, about 40% of the coal-fired power plants in the United States have closed since 2009. And China, which is now the world's largest producer of carbon emissions, has nonetheless reduced its use of coal by 21% since 2007. And in fact, as part of its pledge to continue to reduce its emissions, China is going to include car makers in a planned national carbon trading scheme because that will encourage the production of more electric vehicles. And one of the reasons these kind of changes can be happening is that the cost of clean, renewable energy is dropping, and in fact is dropping faster than most people predicted it would. That drop, in fact, is due, bluntly, largely to government support for renewable energy and mandates about energy efficiency, which exist not only in the U.S. but in many other nations, including like China and Germany and others. You want to know how dramatic the drop in cost has been? Okay. In March 2011, a computer scientist named Ramez Nam looked at the fact that the cost of solar energy had dropped from nearly $10 a watt to about $3 a watt over 2 decades, and predicted it would drop to just 50 cents a watt by 2030. Last year, he admitted he was wrong. The cost of solar power had already dropped to just over 50 cents a watt 15 years early. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, this is a company that invests in renewable energy. In 2015, solar power per unit of output cost 2/3% of what it did in 1975, while the number of solar installations is now 115,000 times what it was then. The same company predicts that even as coal and natural gas will remain cheap, within 15 years, wind and solar will be cheaper than they are in many places in the world, and it'll be cheaper in most of the world within a few years after that. In fact, in some places where solar is most easily available, it's already clearly cheaper. Dubai has received a bid to supply 800 megawatts of solar power at a rate equivalent to US 2.99 cents, less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And it's not just in the Middle East. Austin, Texas, and Palo Alto, California have both signed contracts for solar-generated power at under 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which means even if you take out the federal investment credit for these kind of investments, it still works out to 7 cents per kilowatt hour, which is still well below the national average rate for electricity use. Average residential use costs about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. The bottom line of all this can be found in 2 recent studies. The researchers and engineers from Stanford University and UC Berkeley have developed a state-by-state plan to convert the United States to 100% renewable energy by 2050. That is in just 34 years. Even more significantly, a new Greenpeace report last year from Greenpeace said that it's possible for the entire world to be powered by 100% renewable energy by 2050, including providing energy to the third of the world's populations, electricity, rather, to a third of the world's populations that currently lacks it. Now that prediction may sound impossible, but the fact is Greenpeace has made other such predictions that have come true. In fact, the US-based Meister Consultants Group said last year that, quote, the world's biggest energy agencies, financial institutions, and fossil fuel companies, for the most part, seriously underestimated just how fast clean power sector could and would grow. Meanwhile, Greenpeace didn't. Now this plan of Greenpeace would take a considerable investment, the equivalent of about $1 trillion a year, but it would also reduce fuel costs by about $1 trillion a year, so the investment would essentially pay for itself, which means a renewable energy future is not a pipe dream, it is possible. Which is why those technological advances I cite at the top are so important. Even as they themselves do not reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, even if they themselves do not aid in the transition to a renewable energy future. But what they and other advances can do is to help delay the onset of the worst effects of climate change. Because we're still up against it. Remember that these renewable energy futures, have target dates of around 2050. And last week I was telling you about major effects of climate change in the 2030s. Now that renewable future must be our goal, but it will not arrive soon enough to head off serious climate impacts around the world. But if new technologies about things like CCS can push those timelines for trouble back some, so that, for example, instead of talking about the 2030s, we're talking about the 2040s, then maybe, just maybe, our children and grandchildren won't hate us for our selfishness and indifference. One last thing. The U.S. stands nearly alone in the degree to which global climate change is controversial. A lot of nations might argue about the best way to respond, but the U.S. is about the only one where we're arguing about whether to respond. But even here, there is reason for hope. Surveys by John Krosnick of Stanford University show that nearly 90% of Democrats, 80% of Republicans, 80% of independents rather, and 70% of Republicans believe the increase in the world's temperature over the past century was mostly, or at least partly, caused by humans. And what's more, 90% of Democrats, 80% of independents, and even half, barely half, but half of Republicans believe that global warming will be a serious or very serious problem for the United States. And according to other surveys, the fastest growing segment of our population is the one that's alarmed by climate change and wants action now. So I'm going to end up by asking you the same question I asked last week. Even allowing the blocking the worst of global warming will require some moderation in our standard of living. Was the way you lived, say 20 years ago, so bad that you would be willing to sacrifice a world to not live that way again? That's it for this week. We will see you next week, hopefully with other good, happy news. And until then, you, as always, have the best week you possibly can, and peace.